Begin, and our meeting is in public session, so we just have to wait for the cameras to work there behind you, Wally. So we're fine. Okay, so apologies have been received from Violet and Wynne, TD, and Colm Eastwood, and we also have, obviously, we'll have new members coming on because one of our members, at least, has joined the ministerial ranks. So, if it,
also Chairman from,
pardon?
From Deputy Brendan Smith.
Fine, okay. Brendan Smith I think he lost a brother, and if we propose a vote of sympathy to Brendan Smith on the passing of his brother as well, the committee will join in that, absolutely. If we agree with the rotation, just to explain to our guests, we just rotate the speakers between the different parties. So I'll just read out the rotation. Is Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Sinn Féin, SCLP Alliance, Green Party, Sinn Féin, Labour, Independence, and Aon and basically, so our guests know, it's about 15 minutes we give to each political party, and it's a very relaxed forum, and so we're very happy to to take it at your pace. If we agree that rotation, that's agreed. So today we continue our meetings with the architects of the Good Friday Agreement. All three of our witnesses today made an immense contribution to the peace process and to negotiations on the Good Friday Agreement. On behalf of the committee, I particularly like to welcome Mr. Wally Curran, retired senior official at the Department of An Taoiseach, Ambassador Amy McKee, who's joining us online, a senior official in the Department of Foreign Affairs, currently serving as Ireland's ambassador to Canada, Jamaica and the Bahamas, and Dr. Martin Mansra, former Minister of State and Member of Parliament, and political advisor and Tipperary man as well, of course. We mustn't forget that. So before we begin, this is just a standard reading I have to give. Some limitations as to parliamentary privilege and the practices of the House. The evidence of witnesses physically present or who give evidence from within the parliamentary precincts is protected pursuant to both the Constitution and statute by absolute privilege. Witnesses and participants who are to give evidence from a location outside the parliamentary precincts are asked to note that they may not benefit from the same level of immunity from legal proceedings as a witness giving evidence from within the parliamentary precincts does, and may consider it appropriate to take legal advice in this matter. Witnesses are also asked to note that only evidence connected with the subject matter of the proceedings should be given and should respect directions by the Chair and the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible, they should neither criticise or make charge against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or it identifiable or otherwise engage in speech that might be regarded as damaging to that person's or entity's good name. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or it identifiable. So I now call our witnesses, and I propose to call in this order so the witnesses are aware. First, Mr. Wally Curran, then Ambassador McKee, who's online, and then Dr. Martin Mansra. And as I said, you're all very, very welcome, and I want to assure you that that we're delighted that you're here, and we're happy to have your contribution as you wish to give it. So if Wally Curran would like to make his opening statement in whatever way you wish, you're more than welcome, and we're delighted that you're attending today.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, as you may have noticed, and other people will notice, I have a touch of Parkinson's disease, which gives you a bit of a tremor, pretty moderate most of the time. But sometimes if I get into an exciting situation like this, it can get a bit more active. So I thought that for that reason I don't have an opening statement there myself, as my two colleagues have, but I know material has been circulated there.
Yes. And
I'd obviously be happy to answer any questions or deal with any points that arise out of the material that's been circulated. I thought by way of a warm-up to make sure that the tremor is calming down, I might first of all refer to how my paths have crossed with a few of the people either associated with people who are here present. And the first one that I was going to mention was connection with Senator Blaney. The redoubtable Neil T. Blaney was a member of the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation when I was the Secretary General of it, and he was a formidable contributor. He died in harness, and I had the honour of representing the membership of the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation at his funeral in Mastmount there on the Fannet Peninsula, which was where my wife's people came from. They were McGinley's, and so and then sorry, I just lost my place there.
No, you're fine, Wally. You're fine. You're absolutely fine. I think we all remember the Blaneys, that's for sure, and the Bolans and
So
all the history.
Then I see Senator Curry here, and I had a lot to do with Austin Curry over the years, and even in retirement we used to meet up in Maynooth an odd time, twice a year or something like that. But one incident I recalled from him was immediately after the Ulster Workers' strike. We were over at the meeting of the British Irish Association, either Oxford or Cambridge, and one of the people who was present was Harry Murray, who had been the chairperson of the committee that presided over the Ulster Workers' strike. Another one who was there was Glenn Barr. He was involved in that as well. But and so one of the things that happened there was a big poker school. And I remember Senator Curry's father playing with these formidable characters who had been out in charge of the strike, and there was a kind of a macabre joke, who was going to collect the winnings. Deputy Brendan Smith, I'm sorry he's not here because he's a wonderful parliamentarian who's been involved in all the different parliamentary groups between Ireland and Britain over the years. And I'm sure over the years he fielded, as we did in the Department of Taoiseach, an avalanche of correspondence relating to the closure of Achalane Bridge. And so I was very glad, and after the agreement was reached, Senator George Mitchell was flying up by helicopter for the opening of Achalane Bridge, which of course is now called after him. And I had the privilege of travelling by helicopter with George Mitchell to that event. Fecum gwil an Shanador o Daniel an Shaw agus Tasagam gwil echtente geshoed adela Currafail man and achas tre gweilge egar vel ferste. Commas na gweilge mel ferste. Pishe kantach legar fún meile ma van Keila. Bhí mé suas an sin le haid díospórtaí idir ollscoile agus bhí Céilí le bhar siúil in san ardscoil ag Barshráid Divis agus bhí mar go timpeall sa Cardiff Fífrí Cardiff the high school agus níhéiteach duine berálainn Cardiff a high school ach nar chuala siad muinte cainte scailge in sa car agus hiigeidir go raibh mar de tagart an ardscoil agus so chum aing an céile an sin agus bhfuil le a bhean ag an céile sin.
Minic a hardest sin in Keely's in art school.
So, Senator Black, I don't think she's here either now, but she is doing very important work, of course, with the group Ireland's Future.
She's actually online, Wally.
Okay, she's doing very important work with the Ireland's Future. And I was at the big event in the Tree Arena not long back there, 5,000 people, and that certainly shows there's a considerable interest in the topic of Irish unity at the present time. So, yeah, I mentioned yourself, Chairman, that I saw Brendan Smith and different people were saying that they hope the witnesses wrote down. Now with the Parkinson's, I'm unlikely to be writing anything more down, but I had the opportunity to provide a long witness statement to Dundalk Institute of Technology, who are involved in a consortium. It's put away, as I mentioned, for 40 years, up to the year 2040. Now, nothing I said requires that long an embargo, but possibly maybe it does in other cases. So it's been a long road since I was in Derry on the 5th of October 1968. I had been away in Holland at a course for a period, and I had a car which was getting rusted away in the salt sea air where I lived. So I was painting, when the Civil Rights March was forming up at the bridge in Derry, I was painting my car with rust primer. But my wife, my late wife and her mother were participants in that march more on impulse, and they had to take refuge in a chip shop to avoid getting their head beat in. And later that evening, I myself was at that risk there at Butcher Gate, but a couple of hefty men got me under the elbow and brought me to safety. So that was where I started with my involvement with Northern Ireland. I was the Sunningdale Agreement was supposed to have set up a Council of Ireland, as you all know, and there was to be a joint secretary from the south and a joint secretary from the north, and there was a competition held in the civil service, and for the position of joint secretary for the south, I was successful in that, and I started work on that, but of course, as we know, the Sunningdale Agreement didn't last very long. So they're just a few ways in which my path crossed people who are present or members of your committee, and I'm ready now to answer any questions or take any points that members want to raise.
Thank you very much, Wally. I think, and I say your long experience and your knowledge, and the way that you can greatly enlighten us in a questioning session in relation to what happened and what we need to do now. And what we do normally, Wally, just to explain to you, is that we'll take Eamon, Ambassador Eamon McKee, and then Dr. Martin Mansor, and then we'll put the questions to everybody then, if that's okay.
That's fine.
But thank you for your contribution. So, Ambassador, if you can hear me over there.
Yes, I can.
Okay, so you have the floor, as they say.
Thanks, Cahir. Great honour to be here. And I remember Wally in the Castle Complex, the negotiations, bearing the burden of the North-South negotiations. Remember that very well. So great to see Wally there. I saw Walter Kirwan. I say, who's Walter? Because we all know and love him as Wally. It's great to see him. Martin Mansor, I remember as well, shouldering the burden of the Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution in the run-up to the negotiations. It's great to see Martin as well. And I'm very honoured to be in their company, in the company of all the witnesses that you've called here. You have my statement, and I suppose the main point I want to make, and it's illustrated by what we have here today, is the continuity of expertise developed within the Department of Foreign Affairs and indeed the Department of Taoiseach about the expertise required to manage the Northern Ireland peace process. And this goes back to the Anglo-Irish Agreement of '85, which I think was really, really important because it established the cooperation between the two governments in a formal way. It had an agenda dealing with the causes of the conflict. And it set up a network, a community of officials between London, Dublin, that supported each other, got to know each other, and became a mainstay, I think, of the continuity of effort to bring about peace. The other point I make in my statement is that the Department of Foreign Affairs ran a very successful human resource strategy, which meant that people were circulated through Anglo-Irish Division. And when the time came up for postings, we would be posted to London or Washington or Boston or the other consulates. And this made sure that by the time we had the negotiations with the Good Friday Agreement, we were all pretty expert in the areas that were under our responsibility. And I think that really did help as well. But the process between the Anglo-Irish Agreement of '85 and the Good Friday Agreement at the intergovernmental level meant that an awful lot of the issues that we were dealing with and that were causing conflict had been addressed. So we addressed issues in terms of the administration of justice, job discrimination, public appointments, and so on. And by the time we get to the Good Friday Agreement, a lot of those issues have been dealt with. And of course, we broadly knew the outline of what the settlement was going to be. It was going to have the three strands as defined and envisaged by John Hume. And I'd like to make the point that, of course, John Hume, the SDLP leadership, all through the ranks were absolutely critical to the efforts that we made in steering Northern Ireland towards peace. The other point is the role of the travellers. When the Anglo-Irish Agreement was established in '85, to service the Intergovernmental Conference, we needed travellers dedicated to certain areas so that when we met in conference, our senior politicians and ministers knew what they were talking about. And of course, our travellers engaged with a whole range of stakeholders, NGOs, politicians, solicitors and lawyers who were involved in human rights cases, SDLP politicians, activists, Republican and local. And I think all of this illustrates that, the Good Friday Agreement was not just, as somebody once said, a few good men in a room. It was actually a collective effort of an enormous number of people who took risks for peace at all levels of society. And through the traveller system, we tapped into those and we reported back so that we knew what was going on. And this created a huge continuity of expertise in terms of managing the peace process and dealing with things. The other point is that in looking back on it, I think it does remind us all, and Wally just referred to some of the kind of the violent incidents around Bloody Sunday, but this was pretty continuous throughout the decades. These are very grim times indeed for an awful lot of people. And often in the peace process, we would be, essentially in Ivy House and get surprised or ambushed by events in Northern Ireland and have to deal with them. But as Sean O'Higgin, one of the heads of Anglo-Irish Division, used to say, we had a duty of hope to keep going and so on. So we had an awful lot of partners in Northern Ireland. We had an awful lot of partners in Washington. In my time in the Embassy Washington between 1990 and 1996, I got to see up close the degree of support that we enjoyed within Congress in terms of the Friends of Ireland. I have to say Senator Edward Kennedy was an absolute giant when it came to supporting Ireland, on Northern Ireland, and all other kinds of issues. There was definitely a step change when it came to the Clinton administration, and we had established connections with him and his staff through Dermot Gallagher, who was ambassador at the time, and through Brendan Scannell, who was political director. And so we had this support for the peace process through President Clinton, and that's been well documented, but is well worth underlining because it was absolutely so important. The other point, I suppose, is the expertise that we had and that continuity of effort paid dividends when it came to not only negotiating the Good Friday Agreement, but implementing it. And the process required, I think, as of now, we're counting 29 agreements to implement the agreement. And while we can think about the difficulties in terms of restoring the institutions, so much progress has been made across a whole range of fronts, particularly, I think, on policing. That has made a great difference and has created a sense of stability inside Northern Ireland. So I think myself, Wally and Mansour represent a whole range of officials that were part of a decades-long effort, beginning in 1985, but arguably you could say began with the Haughey-Thatcher summits in the early 1980s, where both governments agreed to cooperate in finding a solution to Northern Ireland, that Northern Ireland was not just a security issue, After my time in Washington, I came back again into the security and justice area, where we dealt with issues like policing and the administration of justice. Dermot Ahern, then the minister at the time, asked me to set up a conflict resolution unit. We did some work there around the world, sharing the lessons of the peace process. And since then, I've enjoyed postings as ambassador to Korea, Israel, and currently Canada. So you have my fuller statement there, and I'm happy, of course, to answer any questions. Thank you, Gaelic.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And obviously your experiences has been obviously very important in making those changes to our relationship north, south and east, west. And I think one thing I would say, and I'll call Dr. Martin Mansour now, is that, the unique and special commitment our civil service, particularly in the Department of Foreign Affairs and indeed the Department of Taoiseach, has been very rewarding in terms of the way our country and our economy developed as a result of the GFA. So, Dr. Martin Mansour, you're no stranger to these houses here, so you have the floor. You're very welcome.
Cahillac and sometime colleague, I would like to read my statement onto the record. I would like to thank the, I would like to thank the Cahillac Deputy Fergus O'Dowd and members for this opportunity to reflect on the Good Friday Agreement 25 years on. And as I recall, I was once a member myself of this committee. And before I pass on, I would like just to signal the enormous contribution made by Niall O'Dowd, your brother, from similar Tipperary background, but the enormous success he had in marshalling Irish-American political opinion during the crucial 1990s. I'm delighted to be here with two former colleagues. Wally Kerwin was a key figure as Assistant Secretary in the Taoiseach's office, indefatigably handling information, writing drafts and making indispensable inputs into both Northern Ireland and European policy. And he led the Secretariat behind the modernisation of the Irish nationalist position in the New Ireland Forum of 1983-4, which recognised the unionist tradition and its validity for the first time. Ambassador Eamon McKee made an incisive contribution to internal deliberations on reformulating Articles 2 and 3, but was also a frontline observer and liaison during standoffs at Drumcree in the mid-1990s. The Good Friday Agreement was both a peace settlement ending a violent conflict lasting 25 years and a political settlement that had to redraw the one of 1921-22 or 2022, creating Northern Ireland because of its shortcomings. Last week, Sir Keir Starmer in Belfast called the agreement, and I quote, the biggest achievement of the Labour Party in his lifetime without question, and praised not only Tony Blair but also John Major. The agreement covered all issues and involved all Northern Ireland parties bar the DUP. The two governments, regardless of other differences or developments, recognise a shared responsibility to maintain peace in Northern Ireland within the democratically endorsed parameters of the agreement. My own involvement as advisor to different Fianna Fáil Taoiseach from Haughey to Ahern centred latterly on the formulation of broad principles that could bring the conflict to an end and offer an alternative political path. This involved direct back-channel discussions mediated through Father Alec Reid, Redemptorist priest, in 1988 with Dermot Ahern, and in 1993, 4 and mid-97 on my own. Written messages and draft replies to and from the Taoiseach Albert Reynolds, deemed to have come through Father Reid, were shared in close partnership with and advised upon by Sean O'Higgins, heading up the Anglo-Irish Control Centre, if I may call it that, in the Department of Foreign Affairs. Trust had to be created, and that was in some ways as much the purpose of the channel as working on specific draft principles. And this was despite the serious political risks for all concerned. In the Downing Street Declaration of the 15th of December 1993, the principle of self-determination concurrently exercised complemented the principle of consent. It included, among other things, two key statements. The aspirational one formulated by John Hume that, and I quote, "Irish unity would only be achieved by those who favour this outcome, persuading those who do not without coercion or violence." The second, by the Taoiseach, considered that the lessons of Northern Ireland, and I quote, "show that stability and well-being will not be found under any political system which is refused allegiance or rejected on ground of identity by a significant minority of those governed by it." And that is a principle that operates both ways, regardless of who is the minority. A second phase of involvement was overseeing politically the replacement of Articles 2 and 3, working with the Attorney General, David Byrne. And here may I interject my sadness at the death of previous AG John Murray, who I worked with on other matters at an earlier time. And David Byrne's senior official, James Hamilton. While legally watertight, the wording had to be accessible and have public appeal. Entitlement to Irish citizenship in the North, a word we owe to Ambassador McKee, meaning a right which did not have to be taken up, squared the circle of the one nation and two nation theories. And constitutional recognition of the diaspora was much welcomed. Article 3 talks about the firm will of the Irish people, and I quote, "in harmony and friendship, to unite everyone on the island." The Shared Island Initiative, which is without prejudice to any future constitutional choice, is reflective of and consistent with that spirit. There is a danger in ratcheting up pressure with claims that unity can be brought about in 7 years' time because of demographic change, or the government creating citizens' assemblies and a Ministry of National Reunification, as if unity is almost inevitable and can, if necessary, be shaped without unionism. We have recently commemorated the centenary of this state, and most people cherish the democratic stability and progress achieved. Despite some past vicissitudes, the experience of the minority tradition has shown that there is life after the Union. The agreement envisages the decision on a border poll by the Secretary of State being evidence-based when it is likely to result in change, which means in practice that estimated initial opinion in favour being steady at well above 50% plus one, because he couldn't come to the conclusion that it would pass if there was effectively a sort of deadlock or between the two views. When we see the difficulties experienced by the evenly balanced Good Friday Agreement that had 70% Northern Ireland or 71% Northern Ireland support in the 1998 vote, what makes us sure that far more sweeping change would be easier? A united Ireland would not be like German unity, where the stronger part absorbed the discredited other. It would de facto be about creating a successor state to both the Republic and Northern Ireland, bringing together the best elements of each. It would likely entail significant reappraisal of ethos and identity, both north and south, as well as Ireland's history and place in the world. Until enough people all round are ready for this, then we must focus in the meantime on making the Good Friday Agreement work better. It has saved lives, ended destruction, and given us peace and stability, though not enough reconciliation, abolition of the hard border, and valuable sectoral cooperation and even integration. And may I recommend a report that has just come into my hands this morning and that I read on the way in here. It's called For Peace and Prosperity, the Economic and Social Benefits of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement by IBEC. And, you know, it's very positive of what has been achieved and also about what remains to be achieved. My final point would be this. The overriding responsibility of everyone is to ensure that whatever evolution in relationships takes place is kept on a strictly peaceful path. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marcy. Can I just say that I was at the launch of that report yesterday morning that you referred to. It was very enlightening. It's a very dynamic, non-political, economic focused report, but it shows the huge importance of the economic prosperity north and south that has resulted directly as a result of the GFA, and it shows the way forward as one island with 7 million people, 3.5 million workers. I think it points out that the growth outside of London in the United Kingdom and all of our island here, that we're second to London in terms of growth in economy and take-home pay and incomes and so on. Like, it's a hugely important economic point that they make there, and that people on average are 65%, their incomes are better off, the poorest people, than they would have been before the GFA. So it really shows the work that all of you, all of our three witnesses today, how valuable it has been, the contribution it's making to our present, our economic and our peaceful island. And I think, we can't thank you enough for that.
Can I just make
Sorry,
one point?
of course, Martin, yeah.
Former Finance Minister Brian Cowen, when he was Finance Minister, did make a speech on how much the peace process had benefited the Republic, not just Northern Ireland. And I think, that's something that we mustn't lose sight of.
Absolutely, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, and I think that's why our committee is so focused on all of us moving forward together. What did you wish to say something?
Just a point I had intended to refer to but forgot. Eamon McKee, he touches this, glancingly on this perhaps, but he and I collaborated with another official in drawing up the dossier that John Bruton gave to Tony Blair about what was then the fresh evidence or the new evidence relating to Bloody Sunday in Derry, January 1972. Now, Eamon did most of the work, but that was a very powerful confidence-building factor at the time when Tony Blair decided to set up the Savile inquiry, which, of course, vindicated the people who were shot on Bloody Sunday. Like Eamon, I was in Guildhall Square in Derry on the day that Prime Minister Cameron made his apology, and when somebody in the relatives put their thumb up behind the stained glass windows at the Guildhall, and it was a very exhilarating moment. But that was a very important thing that Ambassador McKee did. He did most of the work on that dossier. I'm glad to say that I have some opportunities to cooperate with him now again in his capacity as ambassador in Canada, because he and I have connections to do with Newfoundland, the most Irish place in the world outside of Ireland. So I just wanted to make those points. Thanks, Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we'll do our rotation now. So Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Sinn Féin, SDLP, Alliance, Greens, Sinn Féin, Labour, Independence, N2. So Senator Blaney.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Chairman, I think we should take maybe Walter back here someday, off the record, and get an in-depth to all those stories that he has from years gone by, and I suppose the experience he's had over the years meeting many key people that helped build our current peace process. But I first want to set out by saying to Walter, Martin and Eamon, a very sincere thank you for the work that you have done over the years, along with your colleagues in Foreign Affairs, Taoiseach's offices, whatever it may be, under whatever government regime you were under over those years. Thank you for a great piece of work that you've done, because most of you went above and beyond the call of duty and the services you provided to the state in preparation to bring peace to this island, and what we hope is an everlasting peace. And we know there's an awful lot of work to be done in the time ahead to move things on to the next level. But certainly, fantastic foundations have been left by you and your colleagues and the work that you've done. Can I maybe go to Eamon first? Eamon, you talked about working up towards the peace process, and you talked about the continuity of expertise in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and you talked about, I suppose, a lot of the work that was done in preparation for talks on the Good Friday Agreement, and on how necessary they were. And I suppose there's an awful lot of talk nowadays about constitutional change on the island. What's your opinion of things today? Do you feel that there's much work needed on the ground today to prepare for that constitutional change? What's your opinion of the work of the Shared Island Unit? And what's your opinion more generally of other parties and contributors in relation to this? Do you feel we're going the right direction? Recognising that the work up to the Good Friday Agreement was led by the two governments, is the Shared Island Unit the right way to go, and are we giving it the support it deserves?
Yeah, thanks, Senator. I suppose I'd break it down into two parts. The first is to ensure that we retain the success that we've enjoyed so far. And I think we can't make assumptions that we've achieved all of the objectives of the Good Friday Agreement itself. When you read through the Good Friday Agreement, people have often talked about the elasticity of language. It's actually very, very clear. And back in the day, and I remember Sean Higgin launched this idea of parity of esteem, for example. Parity of esteem, equality of treatment, equality of respect are all still issues that I think need work in Northern Ireland. Policing, for example, has made tremendous efforts. I think it's been a real point of stability for Northern Ireland. But again, we've got to be very careful to make sure that it remains fit for purpose, that it is, it's policing the society, that it itself is composed of the elements of society that it seeks to police and so on. I think it's been a tremendous success story, but we just have to continue to pay attention to that. In ways, I think, even if you go back to 1985, the Anglo-Irish Agreement, there are still issues around, economic equality and equity within Northern Ireland. I think the Good Friday Agreement still has to make itself felt in certain areas. If you look at some of these social and economic metrics, for example, there's a lot of catching up to do in certain areas, for example, like dairy. So I think, in a way, we need to make sure that we're as assiduous in pursuing the values and principles of the Good Friday Agreement for Northern Ireland society today, particularly in a society that is changing in terms of its outlook and its the complexity of its demographic and so on. I think in looking to the future, and I think as Martin says, there's an element of instability, I suppose, around the idea of the future of United Ireland and quite what shape that makes. And I think that's a conversation that we have to have with great care and great respect for all of the parties. I fundamentally agree with him that if you're looking at United Ireland, you are looking at a very different state, as it were. And I think we have to have a very searching conversation around the past 100 years, going back to independence, for example. Because if you look at it, what partition is imposed, and it creates two monolithic societies in a way, in which in the South there's quite a degree of consensus. And a point I would make, and I've often made, is that I don't think we've paid enough attention to the damage that was done to Ireland with the abolition of our Parliament in 1800. Now, that sounds like going back a long way, but actually not having a local government from 1800 to 1920 meant that when we took over the state in 1922, the instruments for governance were not great. The Catholic Church was there as almost a government as it had been effectively. And so we have, in a way, down south, we've developed a governance model in not the most propitious environment. And equally, you could say the same about Northern Ireland and why it gave rise to conflict. So I think there's a very searching conversation that we need to have down south as well as up in the north about what is the future society that we envisage. I do think the shared island is a great initiative. I think that is the way to go. And I remember at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, when I was talking in Castle Complex at one point to Martin, I remember having that conversation when we were talking about the North-South cooperation. And Martin was making the point that the one thing we don't want to convey in terms of North-South cooperation to the unionist community is this is some sort of revanchist project to try and get Northern Ireland back by stealth, that it has to be based on the notion of mutual advantage. And Wally was very much part of making sure that the areas of cooperation and the joint bodies that we created were to be for the advantage of everybody. So I think this is a very searching conversation around the future. I think we've got a lot of work to do in terms of how we describe what that is. And we have to consult with an awful lot of people about that. If there is a good example of kind of change management in Northern Ireland, I would recall the Patton Commission on policing. And one of the reasons, there were two reasons I think why they were very effective. One were the terms of reference that we gave them for the Good Friday Agreement. And the second point was that Patton and his commission members went up in the highways and byways of Northern Ireland to find out what did people want from their policing? What were the problems and what were the solutions? Which is why they came up with over 175 recommendations. And of course, the third element was there was an oversight commission to make sure that the recommendations were implemented. But the Patton Commission recommendations were firmly grounded in the views and desires of local communities about what kind of police they wanted. And that's why security sector reform in Northern Ireland was so successful, because it created not a police force, but a police service fully accountable to its people. And I think if we follow that kind of model of listening to people and trying to build a better Ireland, I think that is the way to go. I think it's, from my point of view, being in Canada is fascinating, because the Canadian model actually shows how people of divergent loyalties can share the same space in not just stability, but in a very prosperous country. And the Irish in Canada, the complexity of the Irish situation in Canada, including the Imperial Irish, for example, reminds us of our own very complicated past, that our history is much more complicated than, in some ways, the official narratives. And that the gap between, or the cliche of loyal unionists and disloyal nationalists is actually not correct when you look at our Irish history. And I often make the point that when you go back to 1916, when Yeats talks about, you know, a terrible beauty is born, in a way he's talking about a terrible simplicity is born. Our history is incredibly complicated. And in a way, our future as a united Ireland has to embrace that the complexity of identity that has characterized both unionism and nationalism. So I think we are, you know, in terms of looking at the future, it's a very big topic for discussion that reaches into all kinds of legacies and also all kinds of hope for the future. Sorry, that's probably a very wandering answer, but...
No, it's also a very good answer, and I recognise what you said there about the economic equality. I spent 2 days in Belfast last week, and both unionist and nationalist areas, it's very obvious that governance on the ground isn't working there, politics isn't working, the amount of deprivation, unemployment, I suppose the sense of being lost, having no sense that politicians are going to get them out of the current mess, cost of living, food banks having to do an awful lot of work on the ground just to feed families and keep people above the board. It's a a trying time, and I suppose the reference you made in relation to the Patton report is a good one. But I suppose maybe the lessons of how we got here, I suppose at the end of the day, Martin, the Good Friday Agreement was never fully implemented. All aspects were never fully implemented, and maybe we need to go back and examine why. And I suppose one of the aspects of the Good Friday Agreement was decommissioning, and the decommissioning took a 7-year period. What impact, in your view, had that 7-year implementation of decommissioning? What impact had that on the level of trust that was there in 1998? Was it a factor in losing trust in the, intervening years to now and then?
I'd like to come back on a couple of points, if that's okay. Just seeing our ambassador to Canada there. I mean, Canada is a prime example of a country. If you go to the history of the late 18th century, the assumption was that Canada and the United States would join together and be one. That hasn't happened, and it doesn't look as if it's going to happen now. So, I mean, that is a caution against, inevitability of neighbouring jurisdictions coming together. I have a strong preference, I'd have to say, at this point in time for the gradual evolutionary path. And you mentioned a discussion that we had. If you think about Germany, I was in the embassy in Bonn during the Ostpolitik. And that involved a lot of functional cooperation, cross-border, East-West cooperation, a lot of it under the table as opposed to sort of out there in public, between the German Federal Republic, which of course was far wealthier, and the German Democratic Republic. I remember reporting back to home about a book which claimed that the GDR was the 10th member of the EEC at the time. But the point is, the Ostpolitik itself didn't contribute or didn't bring about German unity. That came about for other reasons, sort of a more general political, economic collapse. But the fact that it had been there was helpful in building a united Germany afterwards, in that there had been some habit of cooperation and so on. And I think the same is true. I mean, North-South cooperation, the single island economy, that is a good value in itself. But if we were to move for other reasons to a united Ireland, then the fact that it had taken place would be distinctly helpful. I mean, obviously, when we're talking about Irish unity referendum, we're talking about something enormously bigger than, say, the Brexit referendum across the water. I would have two concerns about it, particularly if it were to happen, before the conditions are properly satisfied. I mean, one is, and again, this goes back to Canada. I mean, Quebec has had 2 referendums on independence, and both at considerable intervals apart, and both were defeated. I'm not aware of, but maybe you are, of sort of further discussion about a 3rd referendum. I do think that a defeat, whether by a small margin or large, of a border poll, I do not think that that would be helpful to the longer-term aim of a united Ireland. That's a very, very firm conviction. I know there is the other view, which is, well, you have a poll and then you have another poll and so on. But, I mean, the British government may not grant a poll in less than 7 years afterwards, but it doesn't mean to say that they are obliged to do so. And the argument that has been used in relation to Scotland, that was for a generation. But my other concern, and if I could just quote a sentence from Brendan O'Leary's relatively new book, Making Sense of a United Ireland, and I quote, "Unifying Ireland in referendums must be done carefully, to avoid civil war, let alone state collapse. I presume by state collapse they mean in the north rather than here. And I do think that we're dealing with something that if we go at it too hard or too fast, we're dealing with something that could be very dangerous to what has been achieved. And a lot has been achieved, not just south of the border in the Republic. I mean, there are people, and including people from nationalist Republican backgrounds, I mean, who are proud of what's been achieved, especially sort of economically and development-wise in Northern Ireland, over the last 20 years. Now, apologies, to come to your question on decommissioning. Yeah, you see, there was a huge irony is that when the ceasefires were first announced, 31st of August 94, the message coming from Sinn Féin was momentum, 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 and this led to fairly quick reopening of border roads, south of the border, release of prisoners, organisation with Wally of the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation. That got going fast, and John Bruton had the pleasure of meeting Gerry Adams for the first time there. And then even the organisation of the Washington Economic Conference, which brought out, a lot of the community activists from West Belfast, the following May, I think it was. But then, you see, decommissioning, I mean, it was first of all used by the Unionists after the joint framework documents were published as a means of slowing down the momentum. And of course, there had been incidents like in November, about the 9th of November, 1994, the Newry Post Office murder, which sort of gave, I mean, Major was beginning to focus on decommissioning. They had been very careful in the clarification that they gave to 20 Sinn Féin questions. They, first of all, after the Downing Street Declaration, didn't want to provide clarification. But I know I'm supposed to be replying to the chair rather than sort of...
I'm listening, don't worry. They had been very careful. They fully realised that, before the ceasefire, to put it up, the decommissioning up front would have been more than the traffic would bear. Now, I think I have come to the conclusion, both from things I've heard from Father Reid and comments I've read from, is that maybe there was at least momentary consideration of some decommissioning in early 95, but it was pretty quickly dismissed. And clearly it was only going to happen, in the context of a wide agreement. And even then, it was difficult, because the phraseology about decommissioning in the Good Friday Agreement is what one might call weak and aspirational, and didn't really commit anybody to much more than best efforts. But the reason decommissioning happened was that in the end, if Sinn Féin wanted to participate in devolved government for any length of time and on a sustained basis, well, then they would have to bite it. And I remember once being asked on a local radio, did I trust the Sinn Féin leadership, to which my reply was, well, I trust the necessities they're under. And they did want to be in government, so in the end, the weapons had to be let go. But I mean, I can remember, government officials, myself included, there was a little steering group, Paddy Tehan, Tim Dalton, Secretary of the Department of Justice, and whoever was in charge in Foreign Affairs, Dermot Gallagher to begin with. We were told, well, anyone who thinks that decommissioning is going to happen, you're living in cloud cuckoo land. But there's no doubt that held things up. But then there was a subtle tactical shift in about 1999,
because there was the question of the Patten report on the new police service of Northern Ireland. And there was legislation, and the thing is, under unionist pressure, I'm talking about Ulster Unionist Party pressure primarily, you know, Mandelson, who came from what one might call pro-unionist Labour stock, Herbert Morrison, etc., Mandelson tried to pull back. And we were equally firmly, sort of, there was a kind of tug of war taking place. Now, Mandelson had political problems of his own. I think he had to resign at different points at least 2 or 3 times, and so he wasn't always on the scene. It was got back on track, and I agree that I think the PSNI is one of the outstanding achievements of the agreement, and which incidentally shows that with the, things that people predicted would be very difficult, if not impossible, a shared symbolism, the 6 symbols. They did actually, and without too much delay, agree an emblem for the police service of Northern Ireland, but that was seen as one of the biggest. So even symbolic things can be solved if the will is to do that. But there's no doubt about it, which is to come back to your original question, is that decommissioning, and then, you see, the thing about policing is sticking out on policing was in some ways more acceptable to public opinion, nationalist public opinion, than sticking out on decommissioning. I mean, policing was an issue on which the whole nationalist community and people outside Northern Ireland, indeed, had views on. Decommissioning related specifically to the Republican movement and smaller factions. It wasn't something that was germane to the SDLP, for example. So I think that did hold up the momentum, and a lot of the time one felt we had very, very regular meetings. One was going around. When I was young, I could never understand how the Soviets and the US could sit for years across the table about sort of nuclear disarmament and test ban treaties and so on. Having lived through the peace process, I understand it better, because a lot of the time you could be going round and round the mulberry bush and not making any particular thing. But at a certain point in time, a decision would be made on the other side. Okay, we've got the last drop out of the stone. We need to move forward on this, perhaps for wider tactical considerations. So these problems did eventually get solved. Now, of course, with decommissioning, there was the whole fuss that affected American opinion. The so-called Columbia 3, and then other issues. Later on, McCartney and all the rest of it that kind of affected opinion. But I mean, the policing, I think the DUP, had I think a reasonable position in saying is, when if you're going to be in government, the police service has to be supported. Now, the SDLP came to that conclusion quicker, I think, in Western Park in 2001, and got a lot of stick for it as well. They came. You see, my assessment, having attended 1 or 2 meetings in the North, is, should we say, the Republican support were willing to move on policing actually several years before they actually did, but that it was a kind of tactical decision to be taken. Yes, sorry.
No, this is very important and very useful information and very reflective of what happened. Emer.
Thank you very much. I don't think I'll ever forget this project, the report that we're doing on the architects of the Good Friday Agreement. It is, it's brilliant to be here talking to people that were names, such important names at the time, and not just today, throughout the whole process, but people whose names that I heard being spoken about in my own home to get the opportunity to meet with you in this forum is fantastic. And I don't think it's an experience any of us are going to forget, but also that sense of responsibility of everything that has been achieved and what next. And I'm fully aware of myself that what led to the Good Friday Agreement was years of strategizing and concepts that were developed. You know, the three-strand approach didn't happen overnight. It took decades. And any kind of fundamental change has to come from evolution and bringing people on board and trial and error. But it certainly doesn't happen hard and fast. And I totally appreciate that no one wants to compromise the wins that we have had and the success. But at the same time, if it does take years to achieve progress, then there are plenty of people who are unity curious, and unity curious with a capital C rather than a capital U. That are open-minded about what the future looks like, and I would feel that we do have to find a responsible way to evolve and allow these concepts to emerge that could bring us elsewhere. So how do we do that? Whenever you talk about minding ourselves and minding what we have achieved, but also recognising that we are, and to use Reverend John McDowell's phrase, in a time between times, where something seems to want to be birthed. Where do we go from here? And I'm particularly interested in your experience, Wally, of the New Ireland Forum and that experience of bringing people together to carve out what the future could look like, simultaneously juggling consensus and how difficult that was. None of this is easy, and particularly the people that have been involved in it. So what do you think is an appropriate way forward to tackle what is absolutely already and understandably on the agenda?
Well, there's a lot to be said on that. In the New Ireland Forum, well, first of all, I should say, I think as where we are at present, a lot has been achieved, but we're still faced with very considerable difficulties. We don't have an executive, we don't have the Assembly sitting. The degree of trust that was involved in concluding the agreement was slender enough. One of our colleagues, David Donoghue, has brought out a book entitled One Good Day, and he was referring to a remark by Senator Mitchell that we had 700 bad days and we had one good day. And, you know, it was touch and go. I mean, at midday on Good Friday, we didn't know whether we had an agreement or not. And it's only by a whisker that we got that agreement. Picking up from what Martin said earlier, you know, in terms of where we go with citizens' assemblies, with the possibility of a referendum and so on, the one thing we definitely don't want to have is a referendum relating to United Ireland in the South that's lost. And the most recent evidence would suggest that, you know, that's far from unlikely prospect. You could by no means take it for granted that a referendum in the South would be passed. If you look at the data that's coming out in the Ireland's project relating to opinion in the South, and of course in the North, they're suggesting that the evidence that's coming there from those polls and is that a majority in the North would still not vote in favour of United Ireland. So I think we'd have to be very careful about that. I mean, it's going to be a fine balance, because you can't be sure that events might not move faster than you expect. And I'm thinking there in particular of the situation in Scotland. I mean, they're at a bit of an impasse there now, because they have the court decision that they're against insisting on a second referendum if the British government don't agree to have a second referendum in Scotland. What's going to happen there remains to be seen, but if Scotland does eventually go independent, I think it'll have profound implications for the North. I mean, the Unionist population in the North, they're not great lovers of the people in England. Their affiliation is more with Scotland. That's where their ancestors came from. I see that. I think that a lot will depend on there. So we need to be doing the homework and moving forward at a pace which will keep in step with events.
And it's on that point that I think we're agreed, we need to be doing the homework. But
We are doing it to a certain extent into the Shared Ireland Initiative and so on, which I'd be very supportive of. But I suppose so far the work that's been done by way of homework is primarily, it's not focused definitively on the constitutional issue. You know, they're having seminars about the health system and different dimensions of social and economic life and so on, the views of young people and so on. But it's not really getting down to the nitty-gritty of the future constitutional setup in Northern Ireland. It's going to be a very difficult balance, because you need to, as I say, be keeping up with events. But at the same time, as Martin was saying, there are risks if you go too fast and you try and...
Do you think, Martin, that there would be...
Very briefly, I mean, to say, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, there are a lot of studies, conferences taking place, and they have to deal with sort of two scenarios. I mean, one is the scenario that we could be preparing for a united Ireland, or another, just simply that the two jurisdictions get closer together and you build out the single Ireland economy. My point is, and perhaps I should be more explicit about it, is that there's a sort of fine tipping point where doing that sort of useful work, clarifying issues along the way, and there's a lot of interesting clarification in that Brendan O'Leary book I'm referring to, is that if the government starts taking too forward a position, then it starts having political effects north of the border. You see, and what it looks at, you see, what people see, if you're looking in, say, from the loyalist unionist perspective, there isn't at present, there isn't evidence of anything like a majority for who would vote yes in a border poll. Brexit doesn't translate into support for United Ireland. Yes, there has been some shift towards the middle ground. The middle ground has got in line. Instead of being 10%, it's now nearer 20%. And I mean, that is progress. But you see, you could be forgiven, and this would be the loyalist perspective, is, you know, they're trying to roll us over. They're trying to build up such momentum, you know, agitation on the nationalist side, preparing, you know, the government appointing a minister for national reunification as if it was sort of just round the corner. I think one needs to be careful. I mean, the great merit of the Shared Island Initiative is it is not aggressive and it is not perceived as being aggressive. It's something that is absolutely defensible in its own right, irrespective of whether it contributes to a united Ireland or doesn't contribute to a united Ireland. So I think one just needs to be very careful that one doesn't go too far in a zealous. You see, and we know, going back to, I remember we used to talk about this quite a lot in dialogue with Republicans. We had in the late 40s here, we had a big anti-partition campaign. All parties came on board. Northern nationalists came on board. It didn't shift a thing. Uniting nationalists, even ones abroad, and in America, saying that the agreement commits us to a poll. Well, it only commits to a poll in certain circumstances. And I think that what we need to concentrate is on building relations, building connections. I mean, this report I mentioned, I mean, has a whole lot of as material about where economic sectors have effectively been integrated, north and south. I mean, I do think that that's the better way to go. Now, obviously, if I would change my opinion tomorrow if I could see more than anecdotal evidence. I mean, I have met people, I've also read about people, people from Protestant background, even people who used to be in the RIC and whose friends were shot during the Troubles, who've come round to the idea of a united Ireland. But I don't think that has acquired any critical mass so far. And to my mind, the priority of this last while has been to protect what we have. I mean, it's faced a major challenge with the whole sort of Brexit protocol business, with sort of suggestions of reintroduction of some kind of border, north-south, but also our interests as a full member of the EU being prejudiced. Hopefully, we're getting into calmer waters on that, and hopefully that will be resolved. Because what's needed is actually is stability. I heard at an economic conference that I was at recently is people are reluctant to invest in numbers in Belfast at the moment because they don't know what the outcome is going to be on Brexit, the protocol and so on, and investors hate uncertainty. I mean, whether the news is good or bad, they'd like to know what the situation is and what it's going to be for a number of years ahead. At present, they don't have that.
Sorry, if you wish.
I need to nip out for 1 second.
Yeah, no problem, just, yeah. Eamon, if you'd like to make a comment on anything you heard there, if you wish.
Yeah, thanks. I think we have to remember that there's another, before we get to the unity question, the first, let's take it in sequence. What unity means, it's preceded by a shift in sovereignty from London to Dublin. That's effectively what it means. Now, there's no particular provision for how that's done, but if we assume there's a vote on United Ireland, the first thing that has to happen is that London agrees to cede sovereignty to Dublin. We then face a fundamental question. Do we dismantle Northern Ireland in terms of its parliament? What do we do with its policing the PSNI? What do we do with a health service and so on? So that's the first question. If we decide, and this is a big if, and it is a big question, if we decide that Northern Ireland is going to keep its local parliament, well, then obviously you have to think about, well, does that mean that Leinster, Munster and Connaught get their own provincial parliaments with a national government in Dublin? I mean, so one question leads on to another about precisely what do we do when London hands sovereignty over to Dublin. And I think we've got to figure out in governance terms, how do we create stability around that process once that process is underway. Just to go back to the point on decommissioning, and Martin has referred to this, there was, in my view at any rate, there was an intrinsic connection between decommissioning and policing. Conflict is about the breakup of the moral monopoly on violence that normally resides in the state. So the nation state is built around this idea that the use of violence is the right of a government, through the police and the army. And when that social contract breaks down, as it did in Northern Ireland to 1969 onwards, basically what the conflict was about was that the state had lost the moral monopoly on violence. And that, of course, was deeply edged by what happened in Bloody Sunday, but also after Bloody Sunday, because the Lord Chief Justice of Britain said, actually, the victims were guilty themselves and so on, and so there was no rule of law. So the peace process was about returning the monopoly of violence to the state, to the police and the army. And so the retention of weapons by the IRA was in a way a kind of a position of reserve in this experiment around a peace process, around creating a Northern Ireland that we can live in and accept. Let's see how it goes. And so I think, therefore, as the Patten Commission and as policing was being implemented, there was then a really fundamental question of you have to give up, you have to return to the PSNI and to the British Army their moral monopoly on violence. And so in a way, I think those two processes, of decommissioning and policing, ultimately were intrinsically linked. And so when the Republican movement did decommission its weapons, it was basically saying, yes, we are happy that, and we have confidence in policing and being accountable and so on and so forth. So they were very interlocked. So while those years went by, while we were working through this process, there was probably no alternative. In fact, when I came back from the negotiations in Belfast, I talked to Sean O'Higgins and I said, I'm not sure that we can simultaneously create the conditions for power sharing while also changing Northern Ireland and dismantling, for example, the OUC and changing it into PSNI. And Sean said, it's not the time now for that speculative paper. Let's just work this through. And he was absolutely right in terms of that advice. When Martin referred to the skeptics, I remember a couple of just after the Good Friday Agreement, going to up to Northern Ireland, and I met some Republican contacts, and they up in a hotel. And one of them had a live round and threw it across the table at me. And he said, tell Dublin that's the only effing decommissioning they're ever going to see. And they were underlining the point that this is not something we're going to see earlier. And I remember taking it back to Dermot Gallagher. And he said, no. He says, they are going to decommission. They have to. Dermot Gallagher, Paddy T and Tim Dalton, I think we dubbed them the Three Amigos, but they were absolutely in the front line in advancing the decommissioning issue. The other point to make is that the decommissioning issue, once the Republican movement realized how valuable it was and that this was an absolute goal of the British government, for example, to achieve decommissioning and an absolute required assurance for unionism, certainly I think some of the early agreements in terms of implementing the Good Friday Agreement, we got delivery from that through essentially the leverage of decommissioning, and that was a characteristic of the process for many years. But I also want to underline the point that in terms of implementing the agreement, the SDLP, particularly Alex Atwood, Brian Barrington and people like that, and Seamus Mallon, were absolutely key in the forensic details of implementing changes in the Good Friday Agreement, particularly on justice and policing. They did an absolutely outstanding job, as well as, of course, providing the strategic overview. But again, all of these issues underlined, how big these issues were that we were trying to wrestle to the ground.
Thank you very much. I think this is, if that's okay, we'll move on to Sinn Féin and whoever,
Carly agus Gurmaig Lena Fenny Fosta. I just want to thank our witnesses so far for a useful exchange. Wally Gurmaig hasn't made it there to Bill first. It always amazes me the amount of people I meet who can trace the trajectory of their marriage back to Achille and the art school. So you're one of many proud number of people in that regard. And I also I work with Jim Gibney in my office, Wally, who you'll remember from the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation, and he stressed with me the importance of thanking you for your advice to Sinn Féin through Rita O'Hare in the very early days of the peace process, and just your role in that. He said it was always wise and friendly and much appreciated. I think while this has been a really useful exercise, these series of engagements, and it's right and it's proper that we reflect back and study the past and learn from the past, it's also really important that we don't engage in navel-gazing. Because this is the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement Committee, and we all accept and acknowledge the fact that there remains very important, very fundamental issues of that agreement and its outworking that are actually outstanding. So I just want to get all of our contributors' views on the issue of the Good Friday Agreement as a living and an evolving document in the here and now, conscious of the realpolitik that we're in, that we're very much live in at the moment. And as we approach the 25th anniversary, I think it's right again to commemorate and reflect and indeed remember the people who put in so much hard work, whether they're still with us or indeed, like my own colleague, I'm very conscious of Martin McGuinness at this point in time as we come to this anniversary, people who are no longer with us and did the heavy lifting. So I'm also conscious of the Irish government's role in that regard. And as a co-guarantor, not just a participant in the talks and in the negotiations around the agreement, but as a co-guarantor, how important and how would you advise, if you were still in position, the Irish government to ensure that that issue of unimplementation and continued fulfilment of the promise of the agreement is actually to the front and centre as we come now to marking a quarter of a century later. Also want to just ask you a question on the issue, and it's something that I've asked all of our contributors, and Martin, you reflected on the issues of Articles 2 and 3, and I've said at a couple of these meetings, sometimes people think that Articles 2 and 3 were done away with as opposed to replaced, and I'm always interested in getting a view of how, particularly around Article 2 and the issue of the right of everyone born on the island to be part of the Irish nation, how the Irish government can give practical effect to that, and it not just be a notional written down article in the Constitution. On the issue of policing, I mean, you're right to say policing has been transformed. A bit like the agreement, we still have some way to go. By no means is it perfect, and I was certainly involved in the engagement within my own community around engagement with the policing structures and the PSNI in the north. I actually think the greatest strength is in what Eamon touched there, and that's the democratic oversight. It's the injection of human rights obligations and compliance, and that oversight goes from the kind of high level of the policing board right down to the PCSP and community structures. I think that's the real lesson to be learnt there. Two more points, Chair, and then I'll pass the rules. I think we're all agreed on the issue of constitutional change needing to be something new, and we have a fantastic opportunity, I think, to create change and create something new. And we all agree that the work in that regard needs to begin, and we need to engage on that issue right across our society. Yes, with the unionist community, but now increasingly with the new Irish, with people who have disabilities, people from our LGBTQ community, our refugee population as well. And it's about getting an idea of how I certainly hope our economic models will change. I hope our healthcare systems will change north and south for the better. Our housing system will change for the better. Ireland's role on the international stage in terms of the fact that I certainly and my party really fundamentally value our neutrality and see that as a great strength and a great asset on the international stage. So in terms of the issue, and I think we'll have to be careful if the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement taught us anything, it's that we need to be cognizant of language and terminology. And I know, Martin, when you reflected on it, you were talking about from a loyalist perspective. But 25 years ago, the Good Friday Agreement gave us an agreed and democratic pathway, not to agitate, but to advocate and to work towards unity. So, if we see that as aggressive or as we see that as offensive, then essentially what we're in danger of saying is that the Good Friday Agreement is offensive or that it's aggressive. And I don't think it is, except to those who have always opposed it and still to this day don't support the Good Friday Agreement. So I'm conscious, Chair, that of a range of questions and points there too, and Rose still wants in, but certainly on the issue of the Article 2, on the issue of the Irish government's role, because there are also obligations on the Irish government that remain unfulfilled in terms of the agreement as well, and I think it's important that certainly this committee, given our remit and our role, reflects on that at what is a really important juncture in that living, breathing, evolving Good Friday Agreement. So, Jim Lamage, Gormaget.
Okay, Gormaget, Rose.
Gormaget, Niall, and thank you very much. Thank you for the work that you've done for the Good Friday Agreement in achieving that and for here today for sharing that with us. I want to acknowledge it from all three of you. I'll be as brief as I can. First, Wally, in terms of your opening remarks, you referred to the Ireland's Future event. I was at that event as well. Indeed, people travelled from all over the country and from abroad. Irish people came home to that event. Such is the level of interest. And I think we have to hear what's being said by those people and by other people across the country. And I agree, and I think we all agree here in terms of needing to do the homework. And there's lots of people, whether it be academics, the Shared Island Unit and many others doing the homework. I do, however, think it's important that we have a framework for that work within which to work by, and I don't think that should threaten anybody. Now, I think we all agree we need to prepare, and I observe what you say in terms of events could move faster, and if we're not prepared, then I think all of us as legislators have a responsibility to do that, and the government as well. So that's the first observation I would make. So maybe if you could just comment maybe on the Ireland's Future event and what you took from it. But I heard some loud and clear messages at that. In terms of the Good Friday Agreement and it being obviously a living document and something that we are continuously working on from here and as a committee, what it did really well was it set out the architecture, and it resonated with me what Eamon was saying in terms of Canada and the different identities working together, living together, and that type of harmony. And to me, how you create that harmony is by ensuring equality and ensuring that people's rights are upheld, whatever community they came from. And in the Good Friday Agreement, we obviously have the Bill of Rights, we had the Single Equality Bill, we had the Charter of Rights. So we had several pieces there, very substantial pieces, that could provide equality of rights across communities that haven't been implemented. And I think my main question for yourselves is, what can we do as a committee, and what should the Irish government be doing right here, right now, and indeed the British government, to make sure that those rights are implemented, because I'm conscious as well in terms of the equalities that still exist. And that leads me on, I suppose, to the economic aspect of it. And I was at that yesterday as well, at that IBEC, and I very much welcome the Peace and Prosperity initiative that they are currently doing, and I wish them well with that, and I think we'll all be engaged with that. But there are some key things from yesterday in terms, I thought, the opportunities that were outlined there, what had been achieved since the Good Friday Agreement and what continues to be achieved, and the opportunities for the future right across the island. And one of the things that was said was the need to evolve a prosperity model for a new global environment. So that's bringing things forward to the right here, right now, and what we need to do to create prosperity across the island. They talked about the scale of 7 million people as opposed to 5 million people and what could be done there. And the other thing in terms of the macroeconomic model that's been developed by the ESRI and in conjunction with others, I think that will be absolutely significant in forming the basis for us going forward, because one of the challenges we have across the island, but particularly in the north, is that there are huge data gaps there. And people need to be able to see the evidence. So you can take politics out of it if you like, but the absolute evidence of, in terms of, will I be better off? And what does a new Ireland look like regardless? What does the future look like for us all across the island? So maybe, I don't know, Martin, if you could talk to that macroeconomic model there. And I might just leave it at that, but I think we're in a time of opportunity and responsibility. And I thank you for your contributions here today.
Chair, sorry, just quickly, I forgot to make a point, and I'll do it very quickly because I don't want to eat any more into your time. But sometimes we think, in terms of the looking back side of things and learning, I mean, I'm also very conscious of the fact that we think sometimes that the main thrust of the opposition to this, to the Good Friday Agreement and talks and dialogue and everything else, was confined to the north or the elements of the British establishment. I'm also very conscious that the three of you would have been involved in this for a very long time and would have had to remain steadfast throughout what was like really a very vitriolic response to Jerry Adams and John Hume engaging from, you know, the political establishment, from the media, and you had to work and navigate through that to ensure actually that dialogue prevailed in this state as well, and that there was support for seeing that through as well. So I just wanted to get your view on that as well, and it was remiss of me to forget it. So,
Okay. Right. On body, I think yourself,
Well,
whatever.
In regard to the homework and the question that Rose raised about the future, the Ireland's future meeting, as I was saying, I think it's a delicate balance, but I think we do need to begin to move forward a bit on looking at constitutional models. And Canada was one certainly that's in my mind, and it's been in my mind a while, to get the Constitution of Canada and see what's in there about the situation in Quebec versus the rest of Canada. Another one that has struck me as perhaps meriting fresh acquaintance with is the policy that was put forward by Arthur Griffith so long ago, the resurrection of Hungary, a lesson for Ireland. And the Habsburg Austro-Hungarian Empire, it's an interesting one. Did it have a written constitution? I'm not thinking now of dual monarchy or anything. I'm not thinking of monarchy at all, I hasten to add. But you had a situation where Hungary was a kind of not quite maybe, but close to being a full separate partner, and they had an overarching set of institutions to pull the whole thing together. Now, what was I going to say? Yes, in terms of some of the materials that have been published, I think there's some interest, some need to tease out aspects relating to confederation. Now, I don't think it's an open and shut case by any means, but if you think of all the symbolic difficulties that we're going to face in trying to bring forward a new Ireland, and it would be helpful if we were able to look at useful models elsewhere where the two sides, if you like, didn't have to be bound by the same symbolism. It might offer a way forward. Now, I met Senator Michael McDowell, who's been writing about this. I met him as I came in, and I mentioned to him what I was going to say about this. And I see the difficulty there that, you know, if you wanted to have a confederation with two elements, you have the city of Belfast, or you're going to have the city of Belfast in the unit, which is not going the full hog, if you like, in terms of the development of an Irish Ireland. But one way or the other, I think there's homework to be done there, which, as I was saying earlier, we should try and keep pace with the march of events, with an eye on what's happening in Scotland and so on. I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Martin, yeah.
Right, well, I'll try and be as brief as possible. I mean, I would define that, it was in my opening statement. I mean, I think the two governments' position, and I think they would both agree that this is their response, that they have a shared responsibility. Not joint authority, not joint sovereignty, but shared responsibility. And I think that exactly accurately describes what their position is, has been in the recent past, and is likely to be so for some time to come. You often hear people argue, well, this or that aspect of the agreement or the operation of the institutions ought to be changed. Well, now, I remember at the time of the negotiations, George Mitchell, the chairman, he was often pressed, you know, why don't you override or exclude Sinn Féin or the loyalists or the unionists on this or that particular issue. And his assistant, Martha Pope, always used to say the senator likes to have his ducks lined up in a row. And I think the temptation to press the override button should be resisted. If you start to unravel in one corner, you may start unintended consequences unraveling in other ones. Now, you asked about Article 2 and 3 and citizenship and so on. Now, that's a sort of betwixt and between situation. I mean, essentially, it's a right to personal citizenship. It doesn't mean that if you live in Derry and Omagh, you have a vote in Dáil elections here. And if you were to attempt to do that, and I mean, there was, argument about, Sinn Féin, elected Sinn Féin MPs should have the floor of the Dáil, etc., is you would run into that this was, trying to put in the old Articles 2 and 3 by the back door and effectively exercise jurisdiction. So, I mean, there are some limits to what citizenship. Now, I think the government has committed itself, in principle anyway, to vote in presidential elections. But they haven't actually sort of proceeded forward with it. Now, there are two dynamics you referred to, economic and political. I mean, I think the economic, because we live in a sort of mixed economy, I mean, a lot of the dynamic in any economy comes effectively from the private sector and so on, but with encouragement from government. But, one area which is deficient, and I've been involved in a committee of this in the Royal Irish Academy, the deficiencies of higher education in the north, and in particular the lack of higher education in the northwest, which in an ideal world would be done on a cross-border basis, because Derry Donegal is one region. But you see, it could be that some ministers for education, I won't bother pointing out the party, believe in the theory that people could be too overeducated, But I mean, how it serves the unionist interest to have such large numbers going across the water and then staying there, that is, I find impossible to fathom. But anyway, that's their business. I suppose my only message on the sort of political front is we shouldn't talk or behave as if we are taking the political outcomes for granted. That a united Ireland is inevitable, it's going to happen, or so on. I think that sort of raises resistance. I mean, more acceptance of the fact that is for a democratic decision, north and south of the border, and in some respects there would be unpredictable elements as to how that would happen in whatever situation it would be. You mentioned briefly, I think, neutrality. Personally, I'm in favour of neutrality, provided it's recognised that it's a policy, not a status. I mean, the status, effectively, sort of Geneva Treaty-type status, went out the window in 1914 when the sort of Belgian neutrality was overridden. Is that you have got to. You have a policy, and what that means in a particular situation is within wide limits. Each country has to determine that for itself. I mean, Sweden was a neutral up until, well, very recently anyway. I mean, it allowed, up to 1941, it allowed German troops to cross its territory. No, I mean, we certainly didn't go quite that far, in 1940. You mentioned about Hume Adams. One has to realise that there's the public theatre and there's also what's going on in the background. what was some, I mean, there's a good question as to whether Hume Adams actually existed. It's dealt with in Albert Reynolds' autobiography to a certain extent. They did make 3 very good public statements in 1993, but that wasn't exactly what, the reality was a draft declaration which was being worked on by 3 parties, and the third party was the Dublin government. I mean, I even saw a letter from Adams, a private letter obviously from Adams to Reynolds in 1993, in which he referred to what was subsequently called Hume Adams as the Dublin document. So history is actually an awful lot more complicated than what goes out on the public stage. On the question of confederation, which has been raised, as Wally said, by Mike McDougall and was also the New Ireland Forum. Now, Brendan O'Leary argues, and I mean, one can maybe argue with him, I don't know. He argues the confederation is ruled out because it means you first of all have to have an independent Northern Ireland. A confederation is between 2 independent states, and a sort of fairly strong suggestion that there would be strong nationalist Republican objections to the equivalent of an independent Northern Ireland, even if foreign affairs and so on. It was suggested by George Quigley in the, who was also behind the concept of the all-island economy in the early 1990s. So I think on the whole, I wouldn't be in favour of that. What I do think is I've always been, and this is even the time of the New Ireland Forum, and even the times when my party leader, Charles Haughey, was swithering on the other side, I've always actually been in favour of the unitary state. But I think we have to give, within that context, Belfast requires a special status. I mean, remember when the United Irishmen in Belfast, the Presbyterian leadership in the 1790s, they objected to Dublin rule, Dublin Castle rule. So, I mean, it's a thing. It's like Glasgow and Edinburgh and certain other places in the world. We need to give proper recognition to Belfast in any scheme. And I also think that we need to give more recognition to some of the achievements of Northern Ireland. It's very difficult to say you want to unite with a territory or that you respect unionist identity when you completely and totally reject the system of government which is part of their identity and which they have identified. So I think something a bit more nuanced. I'm not in the least suggesting an uncritical attitude to the history of Northern Ireland, far from it. And if I could just finish on one a point.
It's ironic, and I say this somewhat in jest, but it's ironic given that point that it's the Unionists actually staying out of government at the minute in terms of respect for the system of government in the North. So I'm just making that point. And
I want to try and bring in Eamon as well.
A very brief point on the subject of Scotland, which was raised by sort of one of the questioners. Now, I have a Scottish wife, but I've also been involved in discussions with Scottish government, you know, in the late 90s, early 2000s. I'm actually quite sceptical. I'm full of sympathy, but I'm quite sceptical as to whether Scotland will in fact go independent. There are all sorts of problems like what sort of currency do they have, and they have the same prejudice against the euro as you'd find south of the border in England. So my personal advice and instinct was not to draw Scotland into one's calculations, and in any case, you know, I think the degree, you don't hear quite so much, I think, about the Ulster Scots these days as you did 20 years ago. I mean, the ethos of Nicola Sturgeon's Scotland, you know, doesn't have much appeal for unionists. The other thing is Peter Robinson said, and I suspect this is the realpolitik situation in the short term, is that if Scotland did vote for independence, they would maintain the union, or unionists would want to maintain the union with England, and without making too many bones by that. So sometimes sentimental factors have to be overridden.
Eva, would you like to make any comment on this part of the discussion?
Yeah. Thanks, Chair. Yeah, just on the Canadian model, of course, Canada before Confederation in 1867 was a series of of provinces and were brought together actually with the influence of an Irishman, Thomas D'Arcy McGee, who had his eye on misgovernment and misrule in Ireland, and it was
He was a loud man. He was a loud man.
Yeah, he was,
And the
absolutely.
Fenian,
And
who turned out to be unionist, but anyway, there's not too many of them around still.
well, he travelled a long and complicated journey, let's put it that way. But his lasting contribution to Canada was the protection of minority rights, because he was appalled at direct rule in Ireland and its consequences, which included the famine. And he was also appalled at the development of society in the United States. But certainly a lasting legacy for Thomas D'Arcy McGee was the protection of minority rights within Canada. If you were to apply the Canadian model to Ireland, the closest you get would be provincial parliament and then a federal government in Dublin. On the Good Friday Agreement, I think, and as a living document, the effort of the Good Friday Agreement was to empower democratically the people of Northern Ireland, while recognising the all-Ireland nature of Ireland through North-South. And so I think we have to cue to that attempt to make sure that the implementation of the agreement to the greatest extent possible is democratic and empowering. Now, how we do that, I think, is the critical issue of our time, because of the unionist, current unionist position in terms of the restoration of the institutions. But there is certainly unfinished business in the Good Friday Agreement. I don't think anybody would argue that Northern Ireland as it exists today reflects the ambitions that we have and are set out in the Good Friday Agreement. In terms of the British reference was made, yeah, certainly the British government have their own interests. They were not a disinterested party. We've seen that very starkly in terms of the case of Pat Finucane, where they actually abolished the Tribunals of Inquiry Act rather than have an inquiry into the circumstances of his assassination. We also saw it throughout the Savile inquiry, and we've seen it most recently in terms of Brexit. Britain have their own interests. That is the nature of their system. In terms of the economic model and the economics of this, I think it's a really important debate to have, because sometimes we assume identity is very fixed, and I suspect that identity is much more flexible, and that identity is often based on where you think your interests lie in the future for you, your family and children, for example, in terms of your economic betterment. And we could see this in various opinion polls. During the Celtic Tiger year, support for United Ireland within Northern Ireland was higher than it was during the financial crisis, for example. So people will do make those kind of calculations. In terms of, I think it's a good time to look at macroeconomic models as well. We are highly dependent in the South on foreign direct investment. That's a very dynamic area. I certainly think that the support and empowerment of Indigenous sectors is something that needs to be looked at on both sides of the border. But certainly, economic models are a very important part of this debate. On the Hume Adams dialogue, yeah, I think we have to go back to the circumstances. I mean, the vitriol directed at John Hume was quite astonishing for a man who was absolutely dedicated to peace, and again, who had a strategic insight that if you're going to have peace in Ireland, it's not going to happen by building the middle ground outwards. It's by an inclusive process. And I think if you look at the build-up towards the Good Friday Agreement and including the negotiations, the one hallmark of it was inclusivity, that we were making sure that absolutely everything was on the table. And for example, the Women's Coalition during the negotiations they had a license in a way to go around to all the different political parties and to take stock of their views. Were anybody feeling isolated and not included in this? And that was an important role. So inclusivity has always been a key principle, and I think it is something that we have to be guided by in terms of the debate around United Ireland. There's an article in the Dublin Review of Books that is just issued where a writer says that for unionists, listening to the discussion of United Ireland is like being at your own funeral arrangements. So we have to be aware of that too and bear that sensitivity in mind. But equally, I do think we have to have this conversation, because if we don't, we're going to get surprised by events. And there's certainly one scenario that one unionist put to me which is that in the event of a move towards United Ireland, for unionists, you end up in a situation of exodus and enclave. And that a new border is drawn where the burning tires are. And that's why I think we have to have this debate, but in a very inclusive way, so that there are no surprises.
I think that last point is very, very important. And I think that one of the weaknesses of our articulation of the Good Friday Agreement is the lack of unionist involvement in our discussions. And I think that a lot of our, as has been said, a lot of our debate here is without their willing listening, not that our participation. They feel if they participate at all, that their position is gone forever. That's the impression I get. So we have to find a mechanism to engage, be it civic unionism, as is often said, but political unionism particularly, in a way that they don't feel threatened by those discussions. Is not really the reality of it, and it's a finding way of doing that is our problem.
Yeah, and just to make another point as well, which we've had a very, and I've often described it as kind of a hesitant approach to Canada, and we've moved from hesitancy to embrace. I think one of the reasons we had a degree of uncertainty about Canada was because Canada's sovereign is the British Crown. We weren't quite sure what to make of that during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. But because of the visit of Queen Elizabeth II in 2011, and because of the follow-up by our president to Britain in 2014, we all recognise that this was an historic rapprochement, and it came out of the Good Friday Agreement. And I think that's meant that we can now look at Canada and we engage with Canada in a much more fulsome way without those hesitations and reservations. And I think we've begun, certainly over the last number of decades, to re-examine the complexity of Irish identity and nationalist identity. And it is a much more complex thing. And I think that's a very good debate to have, because it means that we're able to look at this and our relationship with Britain, Scotland, Wales, and indeed Canada in a much more embracive way that looks at the embrace of diversity in the past and how we have to manage that for the future.
Thank you. That's very important. Now, we have some members who are online, so I think, and people who haven't spoken, Pauline, if you want to make I appreciate you've come here for quite a while. I don't know if Michelle or Orla want to speak, or is there anybody online there that's a member who'd like to make a contribution?
Yes, Cahir, if I may, I would like to.
Michelle. Michelle, sorry, we just can't see you yet. Yeah, go ahead. We can see you.
There you
now.
go.
Yeah.
I'm on now. The camera's on now. I want to welcome all the witnesses to today's meeting, and it's good to see you all. And I think this has been a useful discussion, and certainly it's my view that the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, the forthcoming 25th anniversary, is a very fundamental moment in Irish history for us all. And while you don't want to juxtapose it with the position around Brexit, I think that has certainly changed opinions in the North amongst a lot of people. And one of the last points are around civic unionism versus political unionism. There's certainly a mood within civic unionism to engage in the debate and to prepare. I'd also be a bit fearful too that, because it's the whim of the British Secretary of State to call a referendum, that you wouldn't want not to be prepared for that. But one of the things that I was hoping to ask, first of all, I think one of the areas that was vital 25 years ago was the fact that a copy of the Good Friday Agreement was posted out to every home, and people could pick it up and read it. And I know these days links are online and all the rest of it, but the fact that every home and a hard copy, and anybody could pick it up and read it, I think was a really valuable exercise. And maybe 25 years on, we should repeat that, because there are people now, we have a whole cohort of young people, young voters, who weren't born during the Good Friday Agreement era, and who obviously have their future is predicated by some of the rights, certainly, that are included in the Good Friday Agreement. So there's also people who have come from other parts of the world and made Ireland their home, who'd be, I presume, very interested in the rights based within the Good Friday Agreement and would be keen to read that document, maybe a lot of them for the first time, and to see what their future could look like in a unified
I think if you can hear me, your voice is breaking up. You want a better broadband up there, yeah. We can't hear
taking
you.
the rights and protections for minorities and all as part of that. But that's just I suppose
Michelle,
a
apologies.
thought at this.
We can't really hear
Yes,
you, Michelle.
and in a Canadian roadshow this year, along with some of my colleagues.
Michelle, I don't know if you
Can
can
you hear me?
We can't-
Hello?
Michelle, your voice.
Is that better now?
Yeah, that's probably better. Yeah, we couldn't hear the last 3 minutes of your contribution.
Okay, I was just basically making the point that
better,
there's
yeah.
a new generation of people who would probably love to read the Good Friday Agreement, and we might want to think about sending a copy out to homes like we did 25 years ago. But I wanted to ask, is particularly Eamon when he's here. I took part in a Unity Roadshow in Canada this year with some of my colleagues. And I don't know if Niall's still here, but he would have been part of it as well.
He is,
and along with Orla and John. And one of the areas I visited, I was in PEI, Halifax and Newfoundland. And one of the things I was lobbied on was the reinstatement of the direct link between Newfoundland and Dublin. My last part of the trip was in Newfoundland, and I had to travel back via Toronto. So I would like to say, and if you get the opportunity to lobby for that very important air network and those linkages again between, as you said, the 33rd county and the rest of Ireland, that would be great. But just your thoughts, as some of my colleagues have alluded to, Good Friday Agreement as a living working document and what it could mean to people who weren't around, either weren't born or weren't in Ireland during the 1990s, and how they could see that as being relevant to their future in Ireland moving on as well. So, Gurmagad, and I appreciate the opportunity to contribute today.
Thank you, Michelle. And just for you answer, Eamon, is there anybody else online that wants to make a contribution? I know Orla was there earlier, or I know Claire Hanna was there as well. And if they're not there, right, we'll go back to you then, Emma. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Oh, I can hear you. Sorry, yes.
Sorry, for some reason my camera just froze there and it wouldn't let me off. I can see online as well, Frances Black is here, so she may want to come in after me because I think she's been on for the majority of the contribution so far.
Frances,
and I think our other colleagues had I just nip off a wee bit early.
Frances can't make a contribution because she's not in the House, unfortunately. That's one of the rules of the committee.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so,
apologies.
Well, thank you for pointing that out, though. I am aware of that. Go ahead.
No problem at all. Look, a lot of it's been covered so far, particularly in relation, I suppose what I was going to veer on to was the citizens' assemblies and what the opinion would be of the contributors in terms of that, in terms of having that debate and discussion. I know there's a lot of discussion at present in terms of a future unity referendum and what that would look like and what a future Irish reunification would look like in terms of our all-island health service, our infrastructure and so forth. And I suppose the Citizens' Assembly, there had been a lot of discussion and debate about that at present. And when I was in Canada, I was also part of the Irish Unity Roadshow along with Michelle and Niall. And at that time, there was a lot of debate and discussion around that. I'm sure you're maybe hearing that on the ground as well, Eamon. Another issue which always comes to the fore, whether it's in Canada or indeed in America as well, had been in relation to presidential voting rights. And I'm sure this is something which is continually brought up, especially to the Irish diaspora across the world in terms of them having presidential voting rights and that being extended to citizens in the north as well. So perhaps just maybe to get your views and thoughts in relation to that. And a third topic I'm just going to veer off to, because I don't think it's been touched on to date, is in relation to the legacy proposals, which are being brought in through Westminster this present moment in time. I know obviously we don't have an assembly or an executive in place in the north at present, but there has been agreement from all of the parties, all of the main parties in the north, in terms of their opposition towards the proposals which are being brought through Westminster at this current time. So maybe just to get your synopsis in terms of what impact you think this will have in the Good Friday Agreement and going forward into the future. So they're just maybe some quick questions to fire through, but thank you for your contribution, and thanks to all the work you've done throughout the years in terms of building peace right across our island.
Thank you, Orla. If we go back to Eamon and then to wrap up, Martin and Wally, if Eamon, I think, if that's okay for us. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just in terms of Newfoundland, I had a great trip there last May, and I was talking to a guy from Waterford, and then I discovered he was actually third generation Fogo Island, but the Waterford accent you could cut with a knife. I mean, the connection is great. Love to see the flight back. I think it's only like 4.5 hours, but of course, Newfoundland and Ireland, it's the shortest distance across the great North Atlantic, and there's a brilliant UNESCO Joint Heritage Project to commemorate the electric cable that was successfully dropped between Heart's Content in Newfoundland and Valentia Island in 1866, which truly was the start of globalization and globalized communication. So that's a great project that we're working with both Heart's Content in Newfoundland and Valentia Island and Kerry to make it a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But it is indicative of the connections between us. I'd also say as well that one of the joys of being in Canada has been discovering the Irish contribution to Canada, which is immense and very, very deep, and a story that's not well known in Canada, is not even well known in Ireland, where we've got some initiatives there to demonstrate the depth of the Irish contribution. I mean, the Irish have been coming to Canada for 3 centuries. I mean, I would support anything to remind people of the Good Friday Agreement. And you kind of think I can remind myself how old I am at this stage, going back 25 years to those negotiations and back further. So all of that I think is necessary, because when you look back on the news footage from the 1970s and 80s, how grim it really all was, and how much change there has been for the good and to maintain that. In a way, I would say what we need to do now is return to the idealism of the Good Friday Agreement. That while we've talked a lot about the pragmatism of it, I think there was a real sense of shared idealism about the future. And I know that people like Gerry Adams, Martin McGuinness, Ian Paisley and so on, they were motivated by creating a better future for their children. That's why they left old habits behind. That's why they felt that this was now the time to make an agreement. We cannot foist this conflict on our children. And I think we have to bear that in mind too, that our generation's responsibility is to build a future that is better than the one of the past, and not to inflict these problems on our children. And that was genuinely a motivating force amongst the political leadership. And again, going back, we haven't mentioned him much, but Albert Reynolds was a key figure in this. The Downing Street Declaration of 1993, absolutely critical breakthrough. The architect of that was Sean O'Higgins, but that set up, essentially addressed the fundamental damage done by partition in not securing the sovereign will of the Irish people. And that declaration was a very intensely thought through formula that led directly to the IRA ceasefire in the following year in 1994. Huge amount of effort, but a lot of it driven by idealism about how do we build a better future. And I think if we use this opportunity with the Good Friday Agreement to remind ourselves what is the future we're looking for. We are looking for a future of equality, of rights, and of justice, and of people who can have a good living, who have economic opportunities and educational opportunities right across Northern Ireland, but also down south. In terms of the models we look at, I mean, I think it's instructive that after 1922, in a way, there have been arguments that we had a counter-revolutionary kind of government in place for all kinds of good reasons as well, stability. But in a way, it's and again, being in Canada has made me think about this. We don't often talk about the damage of colonialism in the South. We don't often talk about its lasting legacies. I mean, one of the reasons we have such a difficulty in getting a good health service is because the origins of our health service go back to the colonial period of direct but very indifferent rule from London for 120 years that allowed the role of the church to develop, for example, in health and education. we haven't been very introspective in the South about the legacies and the long legacies of colonialism. And I think in a way, thinking about United Ireland allows us to have that conversation and remit maybe some of those deficits or address some of the governance issues too, because I don't think you can have a debate about a United Ireland without having implications for the South. And arguably you could say there are as many implications for the South as there are for the North. Going back to Martin's original point that if you're talking about United Ireland, you're talking about new state building. Sorry?
Oh, go ahead, yeah.
In terms of legacy, listen, I dealt a lot with legacy in my time in Anglo-Irish, from the Corey process looking into allegations of collusion, the Savile inquiry, the Finucane case, and this was always going to be a really difficult one, because part of the kind of mindset of those of us involved in the Good Friday Agreement was that we are building for the future. And if we get into a discussion around past narratives and a competition around past narratives, we're never going to go anywhere. But that doesn't mean that we could not, it didn't mean we could leave those issues behind. We had to deal with those issues. And I would say that myself and colleagues in the Irish government in general has been very much to the fore in looking for truth, but particularly justice for the victims of violence in Northern Ireland, including victims by state violence in Northern Ireland. So I won't comment directly on the current legacy proposals, but just that we have to be very mindful about the rule of law and about justice and about it being victim-centred, but victim-centred in a way that is principled and based in human rights law. I think that was more or less it from me. Yeah, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Evan. Wally, would you like to summarise then?
Yes.
Please.
Well, we've touched a certain amount here about the future, well beyond the day after tomorrow. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we have the institutions down at present, and our first priority probably at the present time has to be to try and get the institutions back, to get the dynamic of the Good Friday Agreement working again. In terms of how you do that, I just want to touch on the business about citizens' assemblies and the degree to which the unionist community or representatives of it have taken part in the past efforts. During the week, I had occasion to go back and look at the publications of the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation, and you know, you hear a certain amount of comment in relation to the different fora that the unionists didn't really take part, and the unionist parties as such didn't take part in either the New Ireland Forum or the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation. But I was reminded very much looking over the publications of the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation that was tremendous engagement really by the unionist community in the work and deliberations of the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation. All the Protestant churches were involved, quite a number of different groups of, you know, interested citizens, groups like the Evangelical Contribution to Northern Ireland and so on. There was quite strong engagement, and while I think in the first instance, as I say, we need to prioritise getting the institutions up and going again, there is benefit, and that was shown in the work of the fora and in the forum on Europe as well, of getting out to the public. I see merit in something along the lines of the citizens' assemblies, but maybe not quite so directive as some of the assemblies that have taken place in different topics so far. I think we'd want to retain a degree of flexibility and such that we'd be able to react to what I mentioned as events proceeding possibly faster. I wouldn't like us to be hung up on a particular rhythm of citizens' assemblies. By all means, get out there and have discussions, try and get the engagement from the unionist community that I mentioned we had at the time for Foreign Peace and Reconciliation. But I think this thing should still be directed at political level here by the government and the elected representatives of the people. In the Downing Street Declaration, as Eamon mentioned, there was a section saying that the Taoiseach would check what practices or dimensions in the south were a problem for people in the north, and a lot of work was done on that. And it was surprisingly good progress made, and even on things like symbols and so on, there was good progress made. The Forum for Peace and Reconciliation had a number of subcommittees. They were all, as one would expect with the body like the present one, like yourself, Chairman, but they sort of ran out of political chairman, and I was acting as chairman of the subcommittee that was established to deal with obstacles in the south to reconciliation. And looking back, considerable progress was being made in that committee when unfortunately the bomb went off at Canary Wharf, and the forum went into limbo, as it were, from which it didn't really emerge. But it's worth, I think, digging out that work and looking at it again, because there was considerable progress made there. And as I say, it was very good engagement by the unionist community. To finish up, just to say, I think we really need to get the institutions up and running, to get the North-South Ministerial Council. I was reading over the files at the National Archives in the last week relating to the movements towards the institution, the implementation bodies. And there was great momentum there, and we should be able to get back to it. So a lot will depend on this situation as regards the protocol, and can we break that impasse as the first step, then get the Good Friday Agreement up and humming again, but in a kind of a measured way, take up the dimensions of a future Ireland as well.
Thank you, Chairman. Would you like to?
Sorry, Chair, just before we move on to Martin, I meant to say that, of course, Wally has been a tremendous champion of Newfoundland for many, many years. He's been great, and so any work that we're going to do on that is built on his tremendous support for the Irish connection with Newfoundland. So I just wanted to acknowledge Wally's lasting legacy. He's a well-known man in Newfoundland and well-loved over there too.
I've no doubt of that at all. So, Martin, you're not from Waterford, so you wouldn't have the same connection with you.
Well, Carrick-on-Shore wasn't too far from Waterford, but anyway.
Carrick-on-Shore was a major port of migration to Newfoundland.
I heard that from the Carrick-on-Shore end. I suppose one lesson of the Good Friday Agreement, and which is relevant to future developments, is that it was, as far as possible, inclusive. It involved, and it's the point you made, Chairman, that it is that all parties or all communities were got round the table. Yes, there were one or two exceptions, McCartney and Paisley and so on, but in general, Northern Ireland was pretty well represented round the table, and I do think that any process that leads to constitutional change, whatever preliminary steps are made by different groups or people, if it's going anywhere, it has to end up the same way in a full-scale, all-party plus two governments negotiation. I was once asked to give a talk to some young unionists, this is Ulster unionists now visiting Dublin at least 20 years ago, and I chose the topic of Irish identity and demonstrated that from the late 17th century right through to the present, that in every generation there was a different conception of Irish identity. I mean, Young Ireland was different from the United Irishmen, and they were different from the Fenians, and the Irish Islanders were something again, and so on and so forth. And you can go through sort of systematically Irish, and of course there was a period where the Protestant elite considered they were the Irish nation. I mean, Jonah Barrington wrote The Rise and Fall of the Irish Nation about the fall of Grattan's Parliament. Of course, they were the only people who had political rights. Now, with regard to the institutions being down and back, now this is one area where I have great faith in the British government, because one of the things that I have observed over the past 30, 40 years is a single thread going through their policy is they are absolutely determined to restore devolution any time it is down, and it can be down for all sorts of reasons, and it's not always just one party or one community. But anyway, I think you can absolutely take it that their thirst for having Northern Ireland at a certain degree of arm's length has not in any way slackened, and anyone who thinks that they can boycott it and then they will be left live a comfortable life, political life, they won't. Even the current Secretary of State and so on has Brexiteers, and although they may be, they have been putting pressure on the DUP, and they will continue putting pressure on the DUP regardless of what's agreed on the protocol or not. With regard to presidential polling rights, I suspect the reason that there may be some delay or hesitation in government is that I understand, I haven't followed this closely myself, but that opinion polls in this jurisdiction show a rather negative trend of public opinion, which I think would be based on the argument is, now it depends how you extend it, but if you extend it, you're not just talking about the North, you're talking about Britain, America, and so on, is where the number of people voting for, if it was just on a simple one-to-one basis, there'd be far more electors outside of the Republic of Ireland than inside the Republic of Ireland, and yet the functions of the President would ultimately have to be constitutionally anyway related to the Republic. So I think there are problems there, though sometimes you can have sort of weighted electorates as a way around that problem. With regard to the legacy issues, unfortunately, I think the only constituency the British government is interested in are the folks who live in the south of England, who have connections to people who were involved in controversial actions in the time of the Troubles. There's not much indication, I'm afraid, that there's any great interest in the views of anyone in Northern Ireland. Of course, I can't help sort of reflecting that. And I'm not saying that you can compare the two situations, you can't actually, but what happened in the early 1920s after the Civil War was over, so many crimes had been committed on all sides, the state included, that after about 1924, the last president, there was a kind of general amnesty, and nothing further was done. But that can't be done. People have the democratic right to pursue justice, and here and there they may be successful. The chances of success are not very high. I thought I'd just like to finish and thank you for this session, Cahill, and I must apologise for a characteristic which I think you criticised me for when I was in the House, is that I do have a tendency to be a little garrulous.
I don't think that was well, if it was a useful comment. I think I really enjoyed everybody's contribution today. I've been, feel, if it's a correct word to use, humbled by your experience and your sharing with us all of the activities with the good of everybody living on this island, your careers, Wally, you've been really so impressive. Obviously, your knowledge is is absolutely phenomenal. I know Ambassador, I've been very interested in the way you articulated your view and indeed your knowledge of history, just like Martin's, going back to, going back to the late 18th century. And obviously your ideas in relation to Canada and looking at that as a model, I think is something this committee could usefully pursue. I know, I'm sorry.
Do you mind if I ask just a snippet of a question?
Of course,
Just of Eamon, if you
Sure.
don't mind. Given, I suppose, your portfolio over the years, Eamon, in relation to the United States, and given the role they have played in the past, how important is that relationship with the US? Because sometimes, I think in more recent, probably since the Good Friday Agreement, we're taken for granted. How important is it a relationship? And also given now, how given, as has been mentioned, the legacy bill being driven through in Westminster, the damage that's going to have, how important is it a relationship, and what role do you see that the US administration playing in any future agreements or any future status in Northern Ireland and the Republic?
Yeah, it probably is it's a good question, because we haven't aired that enough. I think absolutely the role of the White House and of the Congress from the United States has been absolutely critical to progress in Northern Ireland. And we go back to first principles. After the Second World War, Britain absolutely tied its global interests and positions to the United States, and that remains to this day. It is absolutely, you cannot over-exaggerate the sensitivity of Downing Street to the White House across all kinds of briefs. And so when the White House is engaged, it makes a huge, huge difference. Certainly Irish diplomatic efforts throughout the conflict in Northern Ireland focused in Washington on the development of the Friends of Ireland in Congress and the Senate, and that was a great investment, and it always paid dividends. If you go back, for example, to the New Ireland Forum and Margaret Thatcher's famous rejection out in terms of its options, it was Ronald Reagan's response, whereby he said, "But Margaret, we need a solution," that got her to engage in the negotiations of the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985. And that was a breakthrough negotiation, in my view, as I've said earlier. Fast forward to the Clinton administration, absolutely critical that we had engagement with them, and that Clinton himself had the intelligence and independence to make his own decisions, contrary even to the advice of the State Department and other agencies in Washington, to grant Gerry Adams a visa, for example, because if the Republicans were going to surrender the leverage of violence, they needed the assurance that they would have the ear of Washington, for example, and they knew that that was really important, as did we. Clinton administration played a key role. Vice President Al Gore, for example, was given the job of making sure that there was outreach to unionism, so that the White House was taking a balanced approach. It was no coincidence that the chair of the talks in Good Friday was George Mitchell, who played a key role in making sure that when text was agreed, it was banked with him and it couldn't be undone or resiled from. Absolutely crucial role that Washington played throughout the Good Friday Agreement negotiations and the subsequent implementation. I'm glad to say that under Global Ireland, the government has invested heavily. We now have an embassy plus 8 consulates in the United States. That's a great development because it gives those very, very deep roots. And as we've seen, I think it's absolutely critical that President Biden and the White House are paying very close attention to the anniversary of the agreement and the efforts to restore the institutions. That gives huge momentum and builds up the opportunity to restore the institutions in Northern Ireland. I don't think you can underplay the significance of the relationship and the interest of the White House and of Congress generally. It's hugely valuable to us and has been in the past. I'd equally say that in terms of Canada, Canada's also made a huge contribution to the Northern Ireland peace process. We had Justice Hoyt on the Saville inquiry. We had Justice Corey do a phenomenal job on allegations of collusion. And of course, my neighbour here, John de Chastelain, as part of the Independent International Commission on Decommissioning, made an absolutely vital contribution. And he told a wonderful story about the achievement of decommissioning. And he said, I was dealing with a quartermaster throughout the destruction of the weapons. And he says, I always noticed that he had a sidearm. And when we destroyed the last batch of weapons, the quartermaster turned to me and said, that's it. And John said to him, no, it's not, and pointed to the sidearm. And in a very redolent moment, the quartermaster took out the weapon and handed it to him. And I thought that was just, it was a great story from a man who, you know, he gave an awful lot to taking the gun out of Irish politics, and he's a great figure, but indicative of the contribution that Canada has also made to the Northern Ireland peace process.
Okay, I think we'll call the meeting to a close now. The public session, we have a private session which won't take too long if that's okay. So we'll just adjourn while our guests leave. So thank you very much indeed again. Thank you.
Thank you.